We'll stay with this issue because Anthony Albanese's holiday upgrades aren't going away because they reflect on the character of our Prime Minister. He says he's the battler's friend from Struggle Street, the Housing Commission kid with the single mum, but he's well and truly left that behind with a $4.5 million clifftop mansion, A-list tickets to everything going, and now all these hundreds of thousands of dollars in Qantas freebies. I mean, you add it up. 22 times he's got a business or first class seat out of a bargain basement economy seat that he bought himself. On an overseas flight, that's about $10,000 in a windfall every single time. $10,000 for him, his son, his now ex-wife, and his girlfriend, now fiancée. That's around $250,000 plus by my calculations. It's the kind of stuff that brings politicians undone because it's something that everyone can understand. It's one thing for taxpayers to walk past MPs and ministers sitting in business class when they're doing their job, but quite another thing when they know the same politician has scored himself a freebie into business or even first class on a private holiday. It's not often that greenish independents criticise Labor Prime Ministers, but that's what happened today from the member for Indi, Helen Haynes, on ABC Radio.
I think it's really inappropriate to solicit gifts of any kind. What we do need, Steve, is a clear line of sight of who is influencing who and how. So too the ACT Senator, the Teal, David Pocock. But he stopped short, of course he did, saying that he'd refer the scandal to the National Anti-Corruption Commission for investigation.
Well, anyone can make a referral to the NAC.
And would you personally consider sending off a referral to the NAC?
I won't be referring this. As I said, I think this is an important thing. There are questions to answer, but don't let this distract us from the bigger issue. We should actually have a broader discussion about reform when it comes to gifts, when it comes to lobbying.
What a fraud. All this talk of integrity unless it's a Labor Prime Minister. Can you imagine the furor if this was a Liberal Prime Minister up to his neck in first-class freebies when he was Transport Minister? Imagine a Health Minister getting free medical treatment or a new set of teeth veneers, or a Tourism Minister getting free accommodation at a luxury resort for him and his family 22 times over. It wasn't that many years ago that an undeclared Paddington bear carried through customs brought down a minister in the Hawke government. The cost of that unpaid customs duty was just over $1,000. Now we're told there's nothing to see here, and even if there is, everyone does it. Well, wrong, Prime Minister. They do not. When I worked for the Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, in his office, his edict to his front bench was that upgrades should be refused. He thought a business class seat was good enough for his ministers, and he didn't like the optics of MPs sitting in first class. He told them too they should forget about booking a suite at a ritzy hotel. A room in a decent hotel, he said, was fair enough when travelling overseas and representing our country, but the sort of stays at the Savoy or Claridge's that had become almost routine in some governments, he said, would not be accepted in his. It's part of the reason why he copped backbiting from disgruntled MPs. Me too. After all, part of my job was to enforce his rules. I can't tell you the number of times I had cranky ministers demand to take their wives on overseas work trips, telling me that this is what they were owed. Even backbenchers too. One who threatened a spill motion, I might add. Now, sorry, I used to tell them, you owe the electorate. You owe the electorate for the privilege of working for them, not the other way around. But that's not the way our Prime Minister sees it. As Labor insider, former Shorten Chief of Staff Cameron Milner wrote yesterday, Albanese has a very carefully curated boy from poverty who made it to PM narrative. Now Albo seems to be guided by a vision of himself as a latter-day Robin Hood, living by the moral code of if you're a poor boy, it's okay to rob from the rich. He would have voters believe, says Labor man Milner, that 28 years in the Parliament brings judgment and experience, But instead, Albanese looks like he's been wallowing in the freebies, all the while sucking down hard on the teat of the taxpayer. Oof. But what makes this story shift from one about a particularly grasping MP to one with serious questions about corruption is the fact that, according to author Joe Aston, Albanese called the Qantas boss, Alan Joyce, as either Transport Minister or Shadow Transport Minister to solicit upgrades for himself and family members, all worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Now, all the while, he was supposed to be in charge of regulating our aviation sector to ensure a fairer go for the travelling public, who, as we know, pay some of the world's highest airline fares to travel within and outside Australia.
Qantas tried to withhold hundreds of millions of dollars of COVID flight credits from their customers, sacked 1,700 workers, had driven prices up, cancellation and delays in the wrong direction, and the Prime Minister, at every step he could do something about competition, has blocked Qatar Airways reporting on cancellation and delays, etc.
Okay.
It's been running a protection racket, Carl, and they blocked last year Alan Joyce coming before the Senate.
I think there are lots of questions about Mr Albanese's credibility and his integrity in relation to the Qatar decision. People in WA and people in the Northern Territory in particular are paying through the nose for airfares, in part because of a lack of competition.
Today, a very tetchy Prime Minister was specifically asked about personally soliciting upgrades from the Qantas boss. He never directly answered the question, instead saying that he had many conversations with Joyce and couldn't recall any discussion of upgrades.
Did you call Alan Joyce personally for these upgrades?
Look, the idea Qantas have a number in terms of bookings that are private bookings. In terms of the only discussions that I can recall with Alan Joyce, we discussed the first flight from Australia to Dubai on an A380. I recall direct discussions with Alan Joyce over the flights, the Emirates or Qantas flight to Dubai, and of course the first flight to Perth. They're the only times that I was on a plane with Alan Joyce.
Listen to that word salad. Listen to that word salad. Instead of telling the truth, he tries to spread the fault by slyly alluding to others who've accepted more upgrades. The point is, mate, they weren't the Transport Minister and they didn't have Alan Joyce on speed dial. Today, my Sky colleagues in Canberra dug through the paper records, old records of disclosures, to find even more flights with an our Prime Minister accepted upgrades, including one flight to London as a relatively new MP, where he was upgraded from economy to first class. Here's another thing too that so far no one else has picked up on. Under the Register of Members' Interests, ministers are supposed not to accept gifts from private sources worth more than $300 or from official government sources worth more than $750. Now, strictly speaking, every upgrade the PM received while a minister should have been valued. Easy enough to do. And he should then have been required to repay the difference between the value of the business or first-class flight he was gifted and the economy ticket he actually paid for, less the $300 threshold limit. Now, breaching these rules as a minister, go back to Mick Young, it's supposed to be a sacking offence. It's there to stop our leaders turning their public duty into a private profit, because it's not as if they're poorly paid. I mean, for 28 years, Anthony Albanese's been on a six-figure salary as a politician. Around $230,000 a year as a backbencher, something like $380,000 as a minister, now $607,000 as Prime Minister. And when you look at his list of freebies and upgrades, ask yourself this: when was the last time this bloke put his hand in his own pocket and paid his way? When? Just because airlines in the past offered upgrades to influential people and fed a sense of entitlement in some of them, that's no excuse for the character flaw inherent in not just accepting upgrades, but calling up and demanded them. Like Tony Abbott did when he was Prime Minister, Albanese could have just said no. He could have just said no. Accepting gifts from an entity you regulate is pretty close to corruption. So what's the point of Canberra's new Anti-Corruption Commission if it doesn't look at something like this?